Disclaimer: the story is a work of fiction intended for mature audiences. It explores themes of awkward situations, emotional tension, and the bond between a parent and child. All events and characters are imaginary, and any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. The story contains moments of humor, emotional conflict, and personal growth. Viewer discretion is advised for sensitive themes. It was a lazy Saturday afternoon, and the house was unusually quiet. I was in the kitchen, staring at the giant loaf of bread my dad had bought earlier. It wasn't just big, it was ridiculously enormous, sticking out of the bread bag like it was made for a family of 10. I had been trying to make a sandwich for myself, but every time I picked up the loaf, it felt impossibly heavy. I muttered under my breath, "Dad, this is too big, it won't fit in my mouth, can you help?" I wasn't expecting him to come running, but as usual, he appeared from the living room, a bemused expression on his face. He leaned against the counter, raising an eyebrow. "Too big, huh?" he said, clearly amused. I flushed, realizing how strange it probably sounded when taken out of context. I tried to explain, waving the bread loaf in the air. I can't handle it alone. It's huge." I couldn't help but feel a mix of embarrassment and frustration. My dad chuckled softly, and for a moment, the tension in the kitchen melted. As he approached, I noticed the way he carefully examined the situation. He wasn't rushing. He wanted to see how I was struggling before stepping in. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes it's easier if you have a little guidance." His voice was calm, almost teasing, and I felt a strange combination of relief and awkwardness. I didn't just need help carrying the loaf, I needed him to show me how to manage it without making a mess of the kitchen or myself. I hesitated, unsure if asking him directly was the right move. But I had no choice. I balanced the loaf as best as I could and extended it toward him. Can you help me hold it?" I whispered, half laughing at how ridiculous the situation seemed. My dad's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Of course," he said, taking the loaf gently. There was a strange rhythm to it, the way we navigated the oversized bread together, and I realized that even in awkward moments, his presence made everything easier. For a fleeting second, I felt like a child again, completely dependent on him, even for something as trivial as a loaf of bread. Yet, there was also a comforting reassurance in his patience, a quiet lesson about asking for help when something felt too big to handle alone. I couldn't help but smile, realizing that this small, silly challenge was turning into a strangely bonding moment. The kitchen, once just a place for meals, now felt like a stage for our shared laughter, awkwardness, and connection. And so, the day began not with drama, but with a tiny, absurd challenge that somehow brought us closer. I didn't yet know that this simple, humorous incident would set the tone for a series of events that would test patience, understanding, and the unspoken bond we shared. But for now, all I could do was laugh at the sheer ridiculousness of the loaf and the way my dad effortlessly made the impossible seem manageable. As my dad and I wrestled with the oversized loaf, I realized that my initial struggle was only the beginning. The bread wasn't just heavy, it was oddly shaped, with a thick crust that made it nearly impossible to slice neatly. I tried pressing down on it with the knife, but it barely budged. "Dad, I think it's too much," I said, my voice tinged with exasperation. I could feel my cheeks turning red, not from embarrassment alone, but from sheer frustration. I wanted to get this done quickly so I could finally eat, but the loaf had other plans. My dad leaned in closer, assessing the situation with a mixture of amusement and patience. Yeah, that is a big one," he admitted, smirking slightly. He didn't mock me though. Instead, he offered a strategy. "Let's cut it together. I'll hold it steady, and you slice carefully. That way, it won't crush in your hands." His calm and practical approach helped me breathe a little easier. I hadn't realized how tense I had been until he gently guided my hand to the knife, showing me the proper angle to make the cut. As we worked together, I noticed that even though the situation was mundane, it carried a subtle tension. I felt a strange mix of gratitude and embarrassment. Gratitude because my dad was genuinely helping me, and embarrassment because, well, the words I had blurted out earlier about it being too big sounded ridiculous now that I had to explain the loaf size in such detail. I couldn't help but stifle a laugh, which made my dad chuckle too. The kitchen, once a place of ordinary tasks, had transformed into a stage for this small but significant moment of bonding. At one point, I almost lost my grip, and the loaf tilted dangerously. "Whoa! Careful," my dad exclaimed, steadying it just in time. My heart raced, a mix of panic and relief. It was ridiculous, over a loaf of bread, but the sense of teamwork and shared effort made it feel important. I realized that sometimes, even the smallest challenges could bring out unexpected emotions and reveal how much you relied on someone else. Then, an unexpected thought crossed my mind. What if this simple scene, so ordinary and trivial, could be misinterpreted? I pushed the idea aside quickly, shaking my head. I didn't need to overthink it. Still, a small part of me felt vulnerable, like this awkward situation exposed a side of me I rarely showed. My dad, however, remained blissfully unaware of my inner turmoil, focused entirely on helping me tackle the impossible bread. Finally, after a few careful attempts, we managed to cut a slice that was just right. I held it in my hand, almost in disbelief that something so simple could feel like such a victory. My dad gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "See? Sometimes you just need a little help," he said with a smile. I nodded, appreciating the lesson more than the sandwich itself. In that moment, I understood that asking for help wasn't a weakness, it was an opportunity to connect and learn. The awkwardness was still there, lingering beneath the surface, but it had softened into something more manageable. What had begun as a simple, frustrating challenge was slowly transforming into a moment of understanding, patience, and mutual respect, a small but meaningful victory for both of us. And little did I know, this too big problem was only the first of several awkward yet enlightening experiences that would define the day. Once we had finally stabilized the giant loaf, my dad stepped back and gave me a patient, yet amused look. "All right," he said, "let's think this through. There's a method to handling something this massive." I rolled my eyes, partly at his dramatics, partly because I was relieved that he was taking over before I made a mess of everything. It was one of those moments where I realized he had a knack for making even the simplest situations feel like a lesson, and, strangely, it was comforting. He guided me through the process step by step, showing me how to balance the loaf, hold it steady, and slice it without crushing it. His hands were steady, his voice calm, and yet there was a playful undertone that made me laugh despite my frustration. "See," he said, gently adjusting my grip, "it's not about strength, it's about technique." I nodded, paying close attention, realizing that the guidance wasn't just about cutting bread, it was a subtle way of teaching patience, focus, and problem-solving. As we worked side by side, I felt a curious mix of emotions. On one hand, there was the embarrassment of having to ask my dad for help in the first place. On the other, there was a quiet relief in knowing he was right there, supporting me. I could see the pride in his eyes, not in a boastful way, but in that quiet, fatherly pride that comes from seeing your child navigate challenges. Even in this trivial situation, it felt significant. At one point, I nearly dropped the loaf entirely. My dad's quick reflexes saved the day, and I could hear his gentle chuckle. "Careful there. You've got to respect the loaf," he teased. I couldn't help but laugh, the tension easing slightly. Humor had a strange way of diffusing my anxiety, making the awkwardness feel lighter. I realized that his guidance wasn't just practical, it was a way of easing my nerves, showing me that it was okay to struggle and make mistakes. As the slices finally took shape, I began to feel a sense of accomplishment. My dad nodded approvingly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Not bad," he said. "See what a little help and guidance can do?" I looked at him, realizing that it wasn't just about the bread. It was about learning to accept support, about trusting someone else's experience while navigating a challenge of my own. Even in the most ridiculous circumstances, he had a way of turning a frustrating moment into a lesson I could carry forward. The atmosphere in the kitchen had shifted from tension to collaboration. I felt a quiet warmth, the kind that comes from realizing that someone genuinely cares and is willing to invest time in helping you grow, even over something as silly as an oversized loaf of bread. I knew that I could handle similar challenges on my own in the future, but there was a comfort in knowing I wasn't alone in the present. By the time we finished, the bread was finally manageable, each slice perfectly cut and ready for sandwiches. I held one up, smiling in triumph. My dad patted my shoulder again, a gesture of encouragement and pride. "See? You did it." "Together," he said. I realized that this simple act, awkward and humorous as it was, had strengthened our bond. It was a small victory, but one that carried lessons far beyond the kitchen. Just as I was beginning to feel proud of our achievement, the sound of the front door opening caught my attention. My older sister, Lisa, had returned from her weekend errands, humming a tune as she stepped into the kitchen. I waved, feeling a bit sheepish, and hoped she wouldn't notice the chaos we had just navigated. But before I could even hide the evidence, the oversized loaf now neatly sliced, she froze mid-step, eyes wide. "Whoa, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice a mixture of surprise and amusement. My dad, ever the calm presence, looked up and smiled. "Just helping with the bread," he explained casually. I felt my face flush red, aware that from Lisa's perspective, the scene could easily be misinterpreted. There I was, holding a giant loaf, flustered and laughing, while Dad was leaning in to study it. I knew her imagination was already running wild, and I braced myself for her teasing. Lisa tilted her head, scrutinizing us suspiciously. Sure," she said slowly, a playful smirk tugging at her lips. She walked closer, raising an eyebrow. "Looks complicated. Are you two okay?" I wanted to burst out laughing, both because of the absurdity of the situation and because I could feel her silently judging us. My dad chuckled, never missing a beat. "Absolutely fine. Just tackling a giant loaf of bread. It's harder than it looks," he said with mock seriousness. Despite his explanation, I could sense that Lisa's mind was spinning. I grabbed the knife carefully and motioned toward the neatly sliced bread. "See? Nothing weird, I swear. It's just bread, really big bread," I said, hoping to diffuse any suspicion. Lisa's smirk softened into a small laugh. "Only you two could make something like bread look like a full-on mission," she teased, shaking her head. I laughed nervously, realizing that sometimes even innocent situations could appear dramatic from the outside. The tension in the kitchen slowly lifted as Lisa joined in the humor. We started joking about the bread disaster, as if it were an epic adventure, laughing at the way the loaf had caused so much chaos. My dad kept his playful tone, teasing both of us, and I felt my embarrassment ease. The potential misunderstanding that had loomed over us moments before dissolved into shared laughter and camaraderie. Still, there was a lingering thought in my mind. Even though the misunderstanding had been cleared, I couldn't ignore how easy it was for ordinary situations to appear unusual or awkward to others. It reminded me that perception mattered, and that communication, even in trivial matters, was key to avoiding unnecessary tension. My dad seemed to sense this, giving me a reassuring nod that said, without words, "Don't worry, everything's fine." By the time the laughter subsided, the kitchen felt lighter, more open, and full of warmth. The oversized loaf, once a source of struggle, had inadvertently become a catalyst for connection, not just between my dad and me, but also with my sister. I realized that sometimes, the most memorable moments weren't perfect or smooth. They were messy, humorous, and full of the little misunderstandings that made life interesting. The day, which had started as a simple challenge, was slowly turning into a lesson about patience, perception, and the unexpected ways that ordinary events could bring people closer together. Even in the midst of potential embarrassment, there was room for laughter, learning, and an unspoken understanding that family could navigate awkwardness together, turning what seemed uncomfortable into a story worth remembering. After the laughter died down, the kitchen settled into a quieter, more relaxed atmosphere. I found myself standing next to my dad, the loaf finally under control, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. There was a comforting silence between us, punctuated only by the occasional scrape of the knife as we cleaned up. I realized how much I had missed moments like this, the simple, unhurried time spent with him without distractions or interruptions. My dad looked at me and smiled, a soft, knowing smile that made me feel seen. "You know," he began, "sometimes the biggest challenges aren't the ones we see, they're the ones that make us uncomfortable or embarrassed. And the trick is learning how to handle them without panicking." I nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in his words. It was more than just bread he was talking about, it was life itself. He had a way of turning even the most ridiculous situations into lessons, gently guiding me without ever making me feel small. We started talking about other small challenges we'd faced together in the past, school projects, household chores, and even minor accidents. Each story carried its own awkwardness, but sharing them now felt different. There was laughter, yes, but also a quiet sense of trust and understanding. I realized that moments like these, messy, imperfect, and slightly embarrassing, were the ones that truly built bonds. It wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. At one point, my dad rested a hand on my shoulder, not in a controlling way, but as a gesture of support. "You did really well handling that," he said, nodding toward the neatly sliced bread. I felt a warm flush of pride, mixed with a subtle vulnerability. It was odd, but even in something as simple as slicing bread, I felt a sense of closeness and appreciation for him. He wasn't just my dad, he was a guide, a steady presence in moments of uncertainty, and a reminder that it was okay to lean on someone you trusted. We continued chatting, and I found myself opening up about little worries I hadn't mentioned before, school stress, friends, and even personal insecurities. My dad listened without judgment, responding with encouragement, advice, or sometimes just a quiet nod that said more than words ever could. I realized that this emotional connection, built over laughter, awkwardness, and tiny victories, was stronger than I had imagined. The afternoon stretched on, and the awkward, too big incident became a distant memory, replaced by a feeling of warmth and mutual respect. I could see in his eyes that he valued these small moments as much as I did, and that realization made me appreciate him even more. We weren't just father and child in a routine household. We were companions navigating life's minor disasters together, learning from each other and sharing experiences that would shape our bond for years to come. By the time we finished cleaning up, I felt a deep sense of emotional connection, a blend of trust, comfort, and subtle pride. It was a rare, quiet victory, one that didn't need to be announced or celebrated loudly. It was ours alone, a shared understanding that sometimes the smallest challenges could lead to the strongest bonds. And in that moment, I knew that no matter how awkward or overwhelming life got, having someone like my dad by my side would make even the biggest obstacles feel manageable. By the time the kitchen was fully cleaned and the last crumbs of bread were swept away, I found myself reflecting on the entire ordeal. What had started as a ridiculous, awkward challenge with an oversized loaf had turned into a surprisingly meaningful experience. I realized that the true lesson wasn't about slicing bread or asking for help with a literal problem. It was about understanding my own limits and being willing to lean on someone I trusted. It was a reminder that asking for guidance didn't make me weak, it made me human. Sitting at the kitchen counter, I thought back to the initial embarrassment I had felt. My flustered words, the awkward phrasing, and the sheer ridiculousness of the moment all seemed silly in hindsight. Yet, it was precisely those elements that had allowed me to connect with my dad in a way I hadn't before. Humor, vulnerability, and honesty had opened the door to a deeper understanding between us, proving that life's awkward moments often carry the most valuable lessons. My dad leaned back in his chair, watching me with a calm, observant expression. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "life will throw all sorts of challenges at you, some too big to handle alone, some just awkward and embarrassing. What matters is how you deal with them. Ask for help when you need it, and don't be afraid to laugh at yourself along the way." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. They weren't just about bread, they were about navigating life with patience, humility, and a willingness to accept support from those who care about you. I also realized the importance of perception. The brief misunderstanding with my sister had reminded me that ordinary events could be misinterpreted if not communicated clearly. Yet, the resolution of that misunderstanding had strengthened our family bond rather than weakened it. I learned that being open and honest, even in the face of potential embarrassment, could turn awkward situations into opportunities for connection and growth. As I glanced at the neatly cut slices of bread, I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. Something as simple as a loaf of bread had become a catalyst for self-reflection, emotional bonding, and personal growth. I realized that life didn't always have to be dramatic to be meaningful. Sometimes, the smallest challenges left the biggest impressions. The act of seeking help, listening to guidance, and working together had transformed a trivial task into an unforgettable lesson. By the end of the afternoon, I felt more confident, not just in my ability to handle tricky situations, but in my understanding of what it meant to rely on someone else. I had discovered the value of patience, humor, and support, and the reassurance that even when things seemed too big to manage, I wasn't alone. The day had given me a new perspective on challenges, a renewed appreciation for my dad, and a quiet sense of pride in how I had navigated the awkwardness with grace. It was a lesson I knew I would carry forward, not just for trivial moments like oversized bread, but for every awkward, confusing, or overwhelming situation I would face in life. Asking for help, accepting guidance, and embracing the humor in life's challenges, these were lessons worth remembering and ones I would never forget. By late afternoon, the initial awkwardness that had filled the kitchen had mostly faded, replaced with a lighthearted sense of accomplishment. The loaf, once the source of so much tension, was now neatly sliced and ready to be enjoyed. My sister, who had briefly misinterpreted the scene, had moved on to helping herself to a slice, joking about how we survived the bread battle. Her laughter was contagious, and it felt like the entire kitchen had shifted into a more relaxed, harmonious space. I realized that the tension from misunderstandings often evaporates once communication and humor step in. My dad and I shared a quiet glance, a silent acknowledgement that what had been a small, awkward challenge had brought us closer. The tension from embarrassment and miscommunication had been replaced by understanding and mutual respect. I felt an unexpected sense of relief, knowing that the small crisis of the too big loaf had not only been resolved, but had strengthened the bond between us. In a strange way, I found satisfaction in how something so trivial had highlighted the importance of patience, guidance, and teamwork. We began tidying the remaining crumbs together, and my dad, ever the teacher, used the moment to reinforce the lessons we had stumbled upon. "See how smoothly things go when we approach problems together?" he asked, stacking the knife and cutting board neatly. I nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. The tension had existed not because of the loaf itself, but because of my initial hesitation and self-consciousness. Once we addressed it openly, it was no longer a problem, it was an experience, and a shared one at that. Even my sister, who had initially teased us, joined in the conversation. She commented on how funny and yet oddly impressive it was that we had managed to navigate such a ridiculous situation without disaster. The shared laughter and casual conversation helped dissipate any lingering embarrassment, transforming what could have been a tense, awkward moment into a story we could all look back on fondly. I realized that sometimes tension exists only in perception, and once it's confronted with honesty and humor, it naturally dissolves. By the time we finished, the kitchen felt alive again, not with stress or embarrassment, but with warmth and camaraderie. I felt proud of myself for managing to ask for help, grateful to my dad for his guidance, and relieved that the situation had been cleared up with no lasting awkwardness. The day had turned into an unexpected lesson on how to navigate challenges with grace, patience, and communication. As I took a final look around the kitchen, I understood that resolution wasn't just about finishing the task, it was about embracing the shared experience, learning from it, and letting go of unnecessary tension. What had started as an embarrassing and seemingly insurmountable challenge had become a bonding experience, full of humor, warmth, and subtle life lessons. I felt an unspoken reassurance that, no matter how awkward or overwhelming situations might seem, they could always be resolved with honesty, guidance, and a touch of patience. By the end of the afternoon, the air in the kitchen was light, and I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The tension was gone, replaced by connection, understanding, and a newfound confidence that even the most awkward moments could be turned into something positive. It was a resolution I would carry with me long after the bread was gone. As evening approached, the kitchen finally quieted down, the oversized loaf now nothing more than neatly stacked slices in the bread box. I sat at the counter, reflecting on the day's events, and a sense of calm washed over me. What had begun as a ridiculous, awkward challenge had transformed into an unexpectedly meaningful experience. The laughter, the embarrassment, the lessons learned, it all felt like a small, perfect snapshot of the bond one shared with my dad. My dad leaned against the counter beside me, watching me with that familiar, steady expression. "You did well today," he said softly. I smiled, feeling a warm, reassuring connection that went beyond words. It wasn't just about handling the loaf or navigating an awkward moment. It was about trust, guidance, and being there for one another in the simplest, yet most important ways. I realized that the true value of these moments lay not in the task itself, but in the emotional connection it fostered. We began chatting about the day, recounting the humorous mishaps and little victories. My sister, who had long since moved on, popped her head in to make one last joke about how dramatic we had been over a loaf of bread. I laughed, shaking my head, realizing how absurd the situation had been. But absurd or not, it had left a lasting impression on all of us. Humor had smoothed the edges of tension, transforming embarrassment into shared memories that we would carry forward. As we cleaned the last dishes and turned off the lights, I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. I had faced a challenge I initially thought was too big and had learned the value of asking for help without shame. My dad had offered guidance with patience and humor, and in doing so, had strengthened our connection. The lesson was clear. Life's challenges, big or small, could be navigated successfully with trust, communication, and a willingness to embrace vulnerability. Walking to my room, I reflected on the day's small victories and subtle lessons. The awkward moments, the laughter, and the shared problem-solving had all combined into an experience that was unexpectedly enriching. I understood that even in trivial, everyday situations, there were opportunities to learn about patience, teamwork, and the importance of emotional bonds. It was a realization that left me feeling grounded and grateful. Before going to bed, I glanced back at the now empty kitchen, a smile tugging at my lips. The too big loaf of bread, which had initially seemed like a source of stress and embarrassment, had become a symbol of connection, guidance, and personal growth. I felt a quiet reassurance that even in the face of awkwardness or uncertainty, the support of someone you trust could turn challenges into meaningful experiences. Finally, as I lay down, I felt an unexpected warmth and satisfaction. The day had been silly, messy, and a little awkward, but it had also been unforgettable. I realized that life's lessons often come wrapped in humor and discomfort, and that the bonds we build in these moments are the ones that last the longest. With that thought, I drifted off, carrying with me a newfound understanding of patience, trust, and the quiet, enduring power of connection. 1.